Alright guys, it's Mr. Westner and we're back to continue learning about Pennsylvania history and specifically the Eastern Woodland Indians who lived here in Pennsylvania about 500 years ago, between 500 and 300 years ago. So last time we talked about, do you remember the name of the group? Started with an A? Algonquin. And do you remember the name of the other group? Started with an H, but sometimes an I was another name that was used. Well, that was the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois. Okay, so we're looking again today more closely at the Haudenosaunee. Last time we spent most of our time on the Algonquian groups or the Algonquin groups. Today we're going to be looking at the Haudenosaunee. Okay, so we're on page 16 if you're following along with me in your ebook. And as we look at page 16, our heading, of course, is Haudenosaunee. Our main idea here says that Haudenosaunee groups included the Erie and the Susquehannock. So those two names should sound fairly familiar to you. Erie, of course, is the name of the Great Lake in Pennsylvania, or near Pennsylvania. And Susquehannock sounds like Susquehanna, which is the name of a river. It's one of Pennsylvania's major rivers that flows down past Harrisburg toward the area in the center of the state. It goes from north to south. It actually begins in New York and it ends in Maryland where it drains into the Chesapeake Bay. So it goes completely through Pennsylvania, kind of in the eastern central portion of the state. Haudenosaunee means people of the longhouse. A longhouse was a long bark-covered building. And there's some examples of a longhouse. A longhouse was a long bark-covered building. Many families lived in one longhouse. So you can imagine, it would be like living with your grandparents, your aunts, your uncles, so your extended family, but maybe some other families as well. So there were many families living together in one very large building. Compare that, or contrast that rather, with the Algonquin people who lived in a wigwam, which was a smaller single-family type of home. So we have the wigwam versus the longhouse is one major difference between the Haudenosaunee and the Algonquin people. Like Algonquin peoples, Haudenosaunee men went to live with their wives' families after marriage. The Erie were one of the earliest Haudenosaunee groups to settle in what is present-day Pennsylvania. This group lived along the shores of Lake Erie. Little is known about them, except that they fought wars with other Haudenosaunee groups. Because of this, the Erie culture disappeared in the mid-1600s. So we didn't know much about them because they fought wars and they were gone before Europeans really arrived in Pennsylvania. So there weren't a lot of explorers that could tell about them. There weren't a lot of other people that had encountered them that could tell their story. So we don't know as much about that group as some of the other groups that European settlers did encounter and then tell stories of back home. About 500 years ago, several Haudenosaunee groups to the north of present-day Pennsylvania joined together. They often battled other American Indian groups in the area. And this was called the Iroquois Nation, okay? Or the Iroquois League. But it was a group of Iroquois or Haudenosaunee people that joined together. And they battled other American Indian groups in the area. These conflicts caused several groups to migrate into what is present-day Pennsylvania in the 1600s. One of these groups was the Susquehannock. The Susquehannock grew corn, squash, and beans. Remember what those are called when you put them together? The Three Sisters. Very good. And we watched the story of that last time. You can always go back and revisit that if you'd like. They also hunted and fished. The Susquehannock settled in one place for several years and moved when the soil no longer produced good crops. Eventually all the nutrients in the soil were used up, so they had to move to a place with new soil and fresh nutrients. They made clothing from deer skin and the fur of beavers, foxes, and wolves and bears. Again, those animals that were present in Pennsylvania at that time, most of which are still here today. Wolves are no longer native to Pennsylvania. They've been hunted to extinction in our state, but some of those creatures are certainly still around. The Susquehannock people use shells, feathers, and fringe to decorate their clothes. Like the Erie, the Susquehannock culture disappeared because of conflict with other groups. Thinking about the description there, something I want you to realize, a lot of times when you see Native Americans depicted in movies or in television programs, that depiction is based on one particular type of Native American. It's particularly true about the tribes that were called the Plains Indians. Well, we're not on the Great Plains. We're not in Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma. Those areas are the Great Plains in our country, the central part of our country, the Midwestern states. Here in the Eastern Woodlands, things look very different. For example, there were these groups we read about, who lived in a teepee? Nobody. Okay? A lot of people think all Indians lived in a teepee, and that's not the case. Here we're in wigwams, we're in longhouses. The clothing, very different. They were wearing leather clothing made out of animal skins. They were wearing furs. In the wintertime, you're not going to be walking around like a Plains Indian in the winter in Pennsylvania. You'd freeze to death. So keep that in mind as you're watching things, because it's not always what history actually looked like. Sometimes Hollywood changes things or does what's easy or what's quick versus what's true. And so the look of the Native Americans that lived here in Pennsylvania would have been quite different than maybe the Indians that lived on the Great Plains or the Indians that lived in the Southwest, groups like the Navajo. Okay? In the Southwest, or groups like the Apache in the Midwest, or the Sioux. Okay, our last section here talks about trade. It says American Indian groups in the 1500s and 1600s sometimes traded with one another. Through trade, they could gain items that they could not make or gather themselves. The Lenni Lenape made bags and baskets of woven grass that they exchanged for food or other goods. Many groups, including the Susquehannock, traded using wampum. Wampum is an Algonquin word that describes pieces of carefully shaped and cut seashell. Wampum could be strung like beads and used as money. Now we're going to look more closely at wampum. It says it could be used like money. Wampum, what it really was a tool for communication. It was a tool to show respect from one group to another. But remember, we spoke different languages, and you had to communicate your needs or your wants without speaking the same language as somebody. So there was a lot of body language, a lot of gestures during these trade meetings, and the pictures on a wampum belt could kind of help with that. So we're going to take a look at some examples of how wampum could be used. And then tomorrow, we're going to be kind of creating and using our own, or designing our own wampum belts and writing about those as well down the road. So that's kind of where we're going. So I'm going to show you some other examples of how wampum would be used as we wrap up our time today. Before we leave the book, let's take a quick look. Over in the lesson summary, they kind of have a table today if you're following along or looking at your ebook. And it says there on the left, Algonquin has wigwams, grew crops, hunted and fished, festivals celebrated the harvest or religion, traded goods. And you can compare and contrast that with the Haudenosaunee on the right side. Instead of wigwams, it's longhouses. But they both grew crops, they both hunted and fished. Haudenosaunee says wore clothing made from deer skin or animal fur, and then they both traded goods. So really, both groups would have used the clothing made from deer skin and animal fur. Both groups had festivals to celebrate the harvest and religion. They're just associating one more with the Algonquin, those festivals, than with the Haudenosaunee, who were a little more warlike and fought more rather than celebrating with those festivals, according to your text here. Okay. All right, let's take a look at some wampum belts.
All right, so we're going to look at some different examples of wampum belts that were created by Native people. And some of these I do know the story of. I do know kind of why they were created. Other ones I really don't. And the one that I'm showing you here on this main page, or on this first page, is the one that was also in your book. This is an example of a wampum belt that was exchanged between William Penn and the Lenni Lenape when William Penn arrived in Pennsylvania. And we'll be learning more about William Penn in Chapter 2, but it's very clear to see what this belt is showing. You can see two people holding hands. It's clearly a belt that was designed to show friendship between those English settlers that were arriving and the Native Americans who were already here. Now, on this belt, there's a lot of different ways you could look at this one, okay? And in the classroom, I usually love to hear different ideas, different interpretations. So feel free to take a quick look and share what you think this belt means in the comments. Write a comment with your thoughts. What do you think this particular belt is showing? Okay. And some of the things, I don't want to talk too quickly while you're thinking, but some people look at these little squares representing maybe homes and the symbol in the middle representing a tree. I've had other people maybe think that those different symbols represent different families or different groups, and that symbol in the middle is sort of a spear point or an arrow point showing in between them, so showing some type of division. So lots of different ways to look at this, and I'm sure some of you have your own stories in mind that are totally different than either of those things. Some have talked about it showing the destruction of the natural resources as European settlers have arrived. So we've got these maybe structures that could represent homes, and then if this item in the middle is a tree, it's showing how there aren't many trees left after the European settlers have arrived. So any of those is possible. I really don't know the original reason behind why this particular belt was created. On this page, there's again some different ways you could look at this. Thinking about what we talked about with the Algonquin and Haudenosaunee people, some people like to think, and this is kind of my interpretation. Again, I don't know what this is, but we have two people on the left, two people on the right, and then this square in the middle. Could it represent two families coming together, or two different groups of people coming together? That's certainly possible. Okay. This one I think is fairly easy to interpret. We have some people holding hands, we have a cross, and we have a small building. So it's pretty easy to understand that that might be a church with people coming together to worship. One of the things that early settlers tried to do, settlers coming from Europe were often members of the Christian religions. So when they came here, they thought one of their jobs was to teach the native people about Christianity. So that may be what's happening in this case. This belt, there's a lot of different ways to look at this bottom one. Let me move myself here. So if you look at this belt, if you're looking at the purple beads, or they kind of look bluish here on the screen, but if you're looking at those, it's hard to see anything. But if you start to look at the white, then maybe this could be a person. This could be maybe some type of house or building. Maybe this is an animal of some type, so maybe this represents a hunt. Maybe it represents people in their village. So you can look at things a little differently depending on which beads you're focusing on, whether you're focusing on the purple or whether you're focusing on the white here. And I think we're maybe intended here to be focused on the white. Now the last belt I'm going to show you, this is one that I definitely know the meaning behind, know the reasons behind. This one is, if you count the figures, we have here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 separate people all joining hands with a house in the center. Now, if you think about that number 13, what does the number 13 have to do with American history? It's a pretty important number in American history. I'll tell you that this belt came a little later than some of the others we were talking about. So this would have been in the later 1700s. And what this belt is showing, this is a belt that would have been circulated among the Native Americans around the time of the American Revolution. So those 13 people joining hands represent the 13 separate colonies joining together to form one nation as we fought against England. So that's kind of the idea there. So I hope you've enjoyed some of those wampum belts. I hope that kind of showed you some things there. Again, you're going to have an opportunity to design your own belt so you can start to think about the symbols. The reason that they were always white and purple is because of the type of shell that was used to make them. These wampum belts or beads were made using the Wampanoag clam shell. So that's kind of what was happening there as well. Thanks, sweetie. I love you too. Okay. Hmm? There is no person, just me. I'm almost done.
Who are you talking to?
I was just talking to the school kids.
How do you talk to them if you can't?
Well, I'm making a video. You can stay down here, honey. Oh, okay. Well, I'm done if you want to stay down here.
I'll be up there if you need anything, okay?
You got it, kiddo. I love you.
Call me down if you need anything, okay?
I will. Love you, sweetie.
Love you. Love you, Daddy.
All right, so I hope that shows you some of the different types of wampum that were used and created. Like I said, you're going to be having your own opportunity to design and create a wampum belt. So think about the symbols you want to use. Think about kind of how you want to represent things and what story you want your belt to show, what you want it to show about you. What you want it to show about you. The reason that all the beads were purple and white has to do with how wampum was created. It was created by making beads from a certain type of seashell, from the Wampanoag clam. So they were purple and white. That's the colors you see on that shell, and then they just polished them and shaped them into those beads, and then drilled a hole in the middle with some of those early tools, and that's how they were created. So hope you enjoyed that. The last thing I have for you here is a video showing how wampum was used, so we'll take a look at that next. All right, so this is a video clip that's going to kind of show how wampum could be used as a communications tool between two groups that really didn't speak the same language. In this case, it's going to be European settlers and traders with the Iroquois Native Americans. This is actually from the mid 1700s. This is going to be a time right before the French and Indian War. So we'll actually hopefully get to watch more of this video down the road when we start talking about the French and Indian War. But for right now, I want to show you this section that talks mainly about how wampum was used, and a little bit of background too as well on the Iroquois.
Why are they firing? It's a way of, well, it's when they fire their guns at the end, you need to work.
And a parley was just termed from it's kind of fat.
Parleys
Oops.
between Indians and whites are a frontier life. Rules well established. Tributes the Indian brought small fortune. The items are more than just gifts. Native people buy European goods for their survival. Providing a steady supply of these necessities will guard towards securing Indian allies. And then there is wampum, crucial in parley. Ancient woven bell encoded messages of war, peace, and friendship. Until there is a ceremonial passing of the wampum, no negotiation would be complete. When it came to winning favor with the Ohio Indians, the British had some catching up to do. Years of land swindles had left native people suspicious of British motives. The French, on the other hand, had traded the Indian nations and fought beside Indian warriors for more than a century. So for the visiting Virginians, this parley was more than just closing a land deal. It was about winning these people over. The Half King and his people are one of many Indian groups and they are far from the most powerful. The dominant force in the Northeast,
So these are all different groups of Native
Six
Americans
nations
in eastern
across
woods.
northern New York. The Iroquois claim sovereignty over the Ohio country. All these lived there. Technically, they haven't authorized the half-kings to Great Britain. So if he goes ahead and does it anyway, he'll be asserting his independence from the Iroquois League. In fact,
There you see Wampum in the
because of human authority. But if he struck the deal British at this parliament, he'll kill you.
Brethren, be assured that the king, our father, in purchasing your lands, had never any...
Why is it taking so long?
He is not...
The way it is with the Indians, there will be much talk and even more getting gifts before the matter is addressed.
Kindly accept this as a symbol of our two peoples living together as one.
Talking goes on more than a week. Finally,
So you heard there him talking about how that belt represented unity, represented our two people living together as one. And it's not a belt in the sense that we think of a belt today as a piece of clothing, something to hold your pants up, but more of a belt as in like a strip. So that was what that was. It was a belt of wampum to show friendship, to show that they were going to work together is what the intent of that was. So just a form of communication as they tried to work out something where they would be able to cooperate. So I hope that made some sense. Thanks so much for watching. Next time you'll be designing and creating your own wampum belt, so think about what you might want to show. Thanks everybody. See you next time.